Well, it's a great pleasure, Stephen,
Okay.
to have a chance to talk to Bill. I'll have to shout quite loudly because my voice has to go into that
I see,
thing
right,
there.
okay, yeah.
So if I shout unnaturally, you'll know why it is. Anyway,
Right.
it's a great pleasure to be talking to Stephen Hugh-Jones, whom I've known for 35 years at least,
At least.
and worked with, and never during that period knowingly had any row or disagreement of an unpleasant kind. So
Good.
I think it was almost the only member of the department, apart from Gilbert Lewis, who I can say that of. So, Stephen, when were you born?
I was born on the 20th September 1945 in Poole, Dorset, England.
Were you?
Yeah.
Oh, right. And let's go back a bit, as far back as you'd like, with your family and people who've ancestors who've influenced your life and decision to become an anthropologist.
I think I really have to start with my paternal ancestors and my father rather than my mother, not because I've got anything against my mother, but simply that my father is one of the major influences, directly and indirectly, in why I became an anthropologist. My father himself he's still alive. He's the illegitimate son of Philip Murrell, who was Lady Ottoline Murrell's husband. And he had a very odd upbringing in that his father half accepted his existence but half denied his existence. So that, for instance, the reason I'm called Hugh-Jones is because my father's father, Philip, at roughly the time that my father was born, Philip Murrell and Lady Ottoline had a child called Hugh, and my father's mother's maiden name was Jones, so that when my father was young, he was initially called Philip Hugh-Jones. And later, when he went up to Cambridge, his father said to him, "I should put a hyphen between the Hugh and the Jones, my boy, because that'll do you good in Cambridge." So I became what Marvin Harris calls one of the hyphenated. There's that chapter in his book, The Hyphenated and the Unhyphenated, like Radcliffe Brown, Evans Pritchard, and there's Hugh-Jones. But just like Radcliffe Brown was actually A.R. Brown, I think there's a sense in which I should be S.H. Jones. Anyhow, my father lived with his mother, who was herself quite an interesting person. She worked on the Nation, the New Statesman and Nation, and she knew Edmund Blunden and various other sort of poets and writers of the time very well. She was on the periphery of the Bloomsbury group in more ways than one. And from what I know, my father's father, Philip Murrell, was quite, in some senses, very encouraging to my father, though kept him slightly hidden and in the background. And my father is a very remarkable person. He's absolutely has always been very fascinated by natural history, and that's a strong element of my life, which will become clear later on. And a great traveller. My father he's just trying to write or finishing writing his memoirs, and he had thought of calling it "I Used Medicine," with meaning both that he employed medicine as a doctor, but also he used medicine for his own ends. And one of the ends that he used to use medicine for was travel, so that he was endlessly getting invited to, or he'd get himself invited to an interesting place like Irian Jaya or Oman or wherever it was, and he'd go and give some lectures in the medical school, and then he would go off travelling, so that I grew up with this man who was constantly travelling, and he did do, he was one of the first outsiders to go and visit Oman, and ditto Irian Jaya, and he went, though these people they used to be called the Aukas, but they're now called the Wairani. in Ecuador, and way back when the Auca or Waurani had killed this. They had killed a series of American missionaries, and my father got himself to Ecuador and went down to these missionaries who were still trying to, or who had by then made contact with the Auca, and there was this woman called Rachel Saint, and I think he managed to cure her of some illness in her base camp, so he was allowed to fly in, and the first outsider apart from these missionaries to go and visit the Aucas. So my childhood and youth was surrounded by Auca spears and all sorts of other things. So that was one strong component of being an anthropologist. And my father, he used to take me on animal collecting expeditions and sent me off to the Marine Biological Station in Dale Fort in Pembrokeshire to learn about marine biology, etc. So travel and natural history and a kind of anthropology were in the air in my family, though I didn't actually know the word anthropology. But my father went on a medical Royal Geographical expedition to the Xingu, and he knew the Villas-Boas brothers, etc. So that some of this happens after I've become an anthropologist, but this was already in the air. But I suppose the other very experience was at the age of, I think, my memory is not entirely correct, I think at the age of 7, my father took us all off to Jamaica because there had been this move to create the University of the West Indies. This was at the time of decolonization, the new wind blowing, the winds of change in the world were blowing. And a team of doctors, but not just doctors, academics of all kinds, went out to Jamaica to create this new university. And so from the age of, I think it's about 7 to 11, I grew up in this university environment on a place called College Common, which was paradise for me. I used to spend my time collecting plants and animals and running pretty wild, and I spent my summer holidays doing sort of snorkel diving on the reefs. And in fact, when I did my entrance exam here in Cambridge, I wrote an essay for the zoology scholarship entrance. I didn't get a scholarship, but I got in. But I wrote this essay on tropical fish. The essay question was about animal coloration, so I wrote an essay about fish camouflage on a tropical reef, using all the vernacular names of the fishes, like grunter and I can't remember the names anyhow, it doesn't really matter, but using all these Jamaican vernacular names, and I could still remember it even at that age. So Jamaica was very, very formative in about 3 or 4 years. And I was sent to a series of schools, none of which were very effective in educating me along official lines, but I learned an awful lot. I learned how to throw stones extremely well, and used this. I was later on under 16. I had the under 16 record for the south of England for throwing javelin, which was a legacy of my Jamaica stone throwing days. I learned to swear. I learned all about sex, and I used to sell the information at prep school when I went back, etc. So I learned a lot of useful arts and crafts and knowledge of life, but what I didn't really learn was reading, writing and arithmetic. And at the age of 10 or 11, my parents effectively panicked, and they sent me back alone across the Atlantic to a prep school called Port Regis in Dorset in order to effectively civilize me, because I had really run wild. I mean, going to school consisted of putting on a pair of shoes, and otherwise I spoke fluent Jamaican patois, and I couldn't speak proper English. I didn't know how to read and write properly. I could sort of make a stab at it, and I don't think I could tell the time. And I was sent to this English prep school, which was an absolute horrific shock for me. It was a real trauma because it was the whole culture of the place was totally different from anything I knew and liked. So I was pretty miserable. In fact, I've still got somewhere the first ever letter that I ever wrote in my life, which is almost indecipherable because the handwriting is so bad. And it says, "Dear Mummy, I am very unhappy. Please tell Nellie," who was our Jamaican servant, or our sort of nanny, "please tell Nellie to send me some. I'm sure there are some green ones on the veranda." And I'm saying I wanted passion fruit because I was feeling sort of deracinated and miserable. Anyhow, I was initially I was mercilessly teased at this prep school, but I was quite tough. I mean, just to sort of give you the flavour of the toughness, one of our favourite games in Jamaica was we used to stand in 2 rows with piles of stones, small, well, big stones, and we used to throw them at each other. And the first team who sustained a sort of injury that we thought was worrying enough for somebody, blood enough for mother to have to deal with it, the other team won. So I mean, we were quite tough. Anyhow, I was initially quite a lot teased, and I remember at one stage somebody broke a model airplane that I had, and I got hold of them and put their head on a stone mullioned window and started going like that. And I was hauled off by a schoolmaster, and I was in terrible trouble, but I acquired the reputation. I was called the murderer for a bit as a result of this. But people stopped messing with me after that. Anyhow, I was set sort of remedial reading stuff and given books which, I'm sure this is partly mythology, because one's memories of childhood are mythology, because you tell these stories at endless times, but they seem to me to be books like John Has the Ball, John Gives the Ball to Jane. Anyhow, I thought reading, I just didn't want to know about reading. And I was rescued effectively by a biology master called, we used to call him Froggy Harthen. I can't remember his first name, Mr. Harthen. H-A-R-T-H-N or H-A-T-H-N, I can't really remember. Anyhow, he realized that I did know quite a lot about natural history, because I spent my time collecting caterpillars in the woods, and my first school report says he has had a good time out of doors. He realized that although I was struggling desperately, I did actually know things, and what I knew about and what I liked was animals and plants and ecology and things. So he gave me Wallace's book, Travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, and there's an extraordinary piece of coincidence about this, which I'll come on to, because this was written in 1853, I think it was, by Wallace, and Wallace goes to the upper Rio Negro, the Vaupés, where I ended up doing my field research. Though when I chose to do the field research, I hadn't got Wallace in mind. But there is a most extraordinary coincidence, because Wallace gave the first ever account of Jurupari rituals, which was what I wrote my PhD thesis on. Jurupari. Anyhow, Froggy Harthen gave me this book, which was full of sort of steel plate engravings of palm trees and Indians and fish and things. I thought, wow, this is really exciting. I do want to know about reading. So really from very, very young, this was one of the reasons that I was determined that I would go to. I already knew about Amazonia. And having been in the tropics, I was determined to get back to the tropics. That was my main impulse, was to get myself back to the tropics, which I loved, and I didn't really like England. I mean, for instance, in terms of botany, when you look at, I remember learning at school about leaf adaptations and the way that different, you've got leaves with tendrils on the end and leaves with hooks on the end and leaves with Dutchman's pipes on the end, all these different modifications of leaves. And when you think about sort of what you have to, you can see all this in English plants, but they're really absolutely pathetic compared to the way in which you get sort of the luxuriance and complicated adaptations of tropical plants and animals. Everything is speeded up and done at a much greater degree of elaboration. So I always just like the tropics. And my father also, while we were in Jamaica, my father went and he led the expedition to climb the mountains in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta in the north of Colombia. So I also had Colombia in my head from an early age. And so at school, what I liked reading, I read quite a lot of novels, and I read a certain amount of, I sort of was fairly diligent as a student in general, but what I really liked was reading about natural history. And my father is, he's now retired, but he was a chest physician, a specialist in gas transfer in the lungs. And my parents, particularly my father, always used to say to me, of course you can do anything you like when you grow up. But then in daily conversation there was sort of things like, well, when you're at medical school such and such would happen. So that I felt that I was sort of stuck in this tramline, that it was inexorable, that I was going to be, I had to become a doctor, or I was going to be forced to become a doctor. And I did zoology, botany and chemistry at school, or initially biology, physics and chemistry at school, because that was what you did in order to become a doctor, and that sort of met with school and parental approval. And sorry, I lost but I'll come back to it. I did these three. I did zoology, biology, physics, and chemistry at school.
You've moved on to another school, obviously. You've moved on to.
Yes, I'd moved on by now to Bryanston School. Yes, I'd moved on to Bryanston. And
how did you find Bryanston? Was it better? You were civilised now.
Bryanston was better. Yes, I was still interested in being out of doors and doing slightly wild things, but yes, no, I got on quite well. And one of the things I found at Bryanston was my wife Christine, who then went on. Yes, she went to Bryanston's sister school, Cranbourne Chase or Critchell, it had, and the top scientists at Cranbourne Chase came over to Bryanston because they didn't have proper school labs in Cranbourne Chase, so they came over to Bryanston to do their chemistry and physics, yeah. And so at the age of 14, this beautiful blonde woman appeared in my chemistry class. I thought, wow, that's good. So I asked her out. In fact, what I asked her to do was, if I asked rather naffly, I said, "Can I carry your books?" And she said, "No, I'm perfectly capable of carrying my own books." Anyhow, that was sort of typical Christine put down. Anyhow, things moved on from there. So that's how we met. And I mean, that's in a sense that's why we ended up doing fieldwork together, because she also has a slightly similar history. She was sort of a bright young thing at school, and her parents actually wanted her to do, because she was a good scientist, they wanted her to do medicine too, so that she and I were in the physics and chemistry classes together. She was good at the maths and I was good at the diagrams and the setting up the apparatus, so we were quite an efficient team on that sort of thing. And she rebelled even quicker, even more radically than I did. I'll come back to what happened to me, but let's get her out of the way for the time being. She, when she finished school, she was supposed to turn up for Cambridge interviews, but actually didn't even bother to turn up, much to her parents' fury, and went to an art school and studied ceramics. She studied ceramics at the Central School of Art, and it was only at the Central School that they were forced to do some kind of other extracurricular education where she did sociology, and it was through sociology that she then decided to become an academic, and she went into LSE. Anyhow, sorry, I'm
You're doing them in tandem.
I'm trying to run too many things. Let me get back to myself. So I was supposed to do medicine, and I had pressure from my parents on the one hand to do medicine, and also I had quite a lot of pressure from school, and that's something I really resented at school, because I can remember one very sort of telling moment where by now I'm a school prefect, and we sat round in the headmaster's study, and the headmaster said to each of the prefects in turn, "What do you think you're going to be, or what are you going to be doing in 10 years' time or 15 years' time? Who are you going to be in life? What's your career going to be?" And they all said sort of worthy things like, "I'm going to be a banker, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a stockbroker," blah, 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 predictable stuff. And I said, "Well, in 10 years' time, I'm going to be living with Amazonian Indians." And he more or less said, "Oh, well, you won't make any money doing that, and you'll soon grow out of that sort of idea." So that in a way, nobody took this very seriously, though my father, in his more enlightened moments, encouraged it. But he always used to say, "Well, you can always do anthropology later, or you can always study these other things later. Why don't you study medicine first? Because you can always get a job, and it's such a useful thing to do." So I sort of accepted this, but somewhat unwillingly. And when I had by then sort of decided that it was inevitable that I was going to become a medical student, so I sort of hatched this alternative plan for my life to get out and escape. So I wrote to the Villas Boas brothers. Do you know the guys who run this, or ran, they're now dead, the Xingu National Park? And said to them, I think I must have been 16 at the time, I wrote to them saying that I would very much like to come and work with them, because by now I was reading quite a lot about Indians. And they said, "Well, we can't accept you, you're too young, and anyhow it would be much better if you studied anthropology first." And it was by now that I really began to sort of pick up on the idea of doing anthropology. But the problem was that there was medicine in the way. So I began to read anthropology. I actually began to get, we had a wonderful thing at the school where you were allowed to buy books. You could go down to the book room. I mean, my parents used to get slightly irritated with me because I spent a lot of money on books, but you could just order books. So I ordered Ruth Benedict's Patterns of Culture. That was the first anthropology book I ever had, the first serious anthropology book I had. And I read this and shared it with, I was by then the great friends of Alfred Gell, and in fact Alfred Gell and I shared a prefect study. Alfred wasn't a prefect, but I became a prefect on condition that Alfred could share a study with me. So Alfred and I read Patterns of Culture. Neither of us thought much of it, actually. We were already rather suspicious of the sort of intellectual framework which it used. But anyhow, the idea grabbed us both. And I also read Levi-Strauss's Tristes Tropiques, because that was about Brazil and Amazonia and Indians and stuff. And I thought that was much more interesting. I think the structuralism went way over my head at the time. I think I was probably more interested in the photographs than the romantic bits, but although I probably did learn something from it. Anyhow, I pursued this idea of escaping, and I then went down. I had to go for interviews with at medical schools in London, and I remember.
It might be if you put your arms down just for the sound, okay?
I remember being asked by the guy interviewing me. He said, "Did I play rugby?" And I said, "No, I didn't play rugby." And did I this, did I that, and what were my interests in medicine? And I was singularly unconvincing about the whole thing. And he, in sort of bored desperation, he sort of picked up his my application form and read down it, thinking, what else am I going to ask this guy? And his eyes lit upon my name, and he said, "Are you the son of Dr. Philip Hugh-Jones?" And I said, "Yes." And he got up, said, "Jolly pleased to meet you." And so rather to my disappointment, I was admitted to whichever medical school it was. I think it was St. Mary's, but I can't remember. And then I had interviews at Cambridge, and I put my father... My father was at King's, so not exactly to spite him, but in order to sort of distance myself from him, I put King's last on my preferences. And I suppose at school's bidding put Key's top of my preferences because Key's was the great medical college, and I came up for interviews. And I made a complete mess of it all because they said, "Well, tell us about your interest in medicine," and I sort of vaguely said, "Well, I'm interested in neurology," just for want of anything better to say. And they said, "Well, tell us more about your interest." And I said, "Well, it's a study of nerves, isn't it?" And got no further than that. Anyhow, I didn't get in there, and I didn't get in I think it was Peterhouse, I can't remember. And I was really very pleased because I didn't want to get in. I just didn't want to do this stuff. And then I had an interview at King's, and by this stage I said, when I was interviewed for medicine, they said, "Well, tell us about your interest." And I said, "If you want to know the truth, I'm not interested in medicine in the slightest. I don't want to read medicine," and hoping that they would just leave me alone and let me go away. And they said, "Well, what are you interested in?" And I said, well, sort of slightly timorously, having been told at school that this wasn't a respectable thing, I said, "Well, if you really want to know, I'm interested in South American Indians and anthropology." And they said, "Oh, we've got Edmund Leach is here. He likes that sort of thing. He knows about that sort of thing. Would you like an interview with him?" And I said, "Yes. Well, yes, sounds a very good idea. If he knows about that sort of thing, I'd love to talk to him." So this was I didn't know this, but I mean, this was a most extraordinary sort of happenstance coincidence, because Edmund's family all of them had lived in Argentina. Edmund was the last of a group of brothers, the only one who didn't speak Spanish. The RAI's Esperanza Fund is called after the sugar mill that they owned in northern Argentina. And Edmund on the one hand, had an interest and attachment to Latin America, but not that much knowledge about it, and had sort of, I think, I got the impression, felt slightly that he would have liked to have known more and would have liked to have been included more, though the Argentina that he knew about was the one that he didn't like, because his own brothers were very much cricket-playing Anglo-Argentines, whilst I think Edmund, if he'd been in South America, would have been more interested in the Indians and the archaeology and things like that. Anyhow, on the one hand, Edmund was kind of predisposed to Latin America, and on the other hand, Edmund was the interpreter of Levi-Strauss, Levi-Strauss and structuralism being all the rage in, this is 1962, it must have been. Just the beginnings of the sort of structuralist fad in Britain, and Edmund already having read Les Structures Élémentaires and being interested in Levi-Strauss, knowing that most of Levi-Strauss's work on mythology was based on, and Tristra Peak was based on Borrow and other Nambiquara material, but that nobody in Britain, the only person in Britain who had at this point really been to South America was Francis Huxley, who wrote that book Affable Savages, which wasn't considered pucker anthropology, it was a bit of a travelogue. Anyhow, here suddenly in Edmund's study appears this young man who knows actually quite a lot about South American Indians, has actually heard of Levi-Strauss, knows about the Borrow, and so I had a very, very long interview with him, and he was, he had that sort of funny laughter that he had, and extraordinary, And we talked and we talked and we talked, and I told him, actually, I told him quite honestly about my dilemma about medicine, and that I had intended to get out, to escape, and go and find my fortune with the V.S. Boas brothers, or go travelling. Anyhow, I'd been decided to go to South America one way or another and not go to medical school. And he said, well, you don't have to run away, effectively. You can come here, we'll give you a place here. And I was more or less admitted on the spot. But follow your plan and go to South America, because I'd planned to go to South America. So I came out sort of feeling, walking on air, thinking, wow, things are really possible. This isn't university, far from being an impediment to my dreams and plans. This is actually going to be a facilitator to what I really want to do, which was go and live with Indians and be in the Amazon jungle. In parenthesis, at boarding school, I had also developed an interest in archaeology, because when they were building the new music school, they came across the remains of a Romano-British settlement, and so I instantly founded the archaeology club, which was probably more a treasure hunting exercise than serious archaeology. But we did do an excavation, and I think we sort of mimicked what you're supposed to do with grids and all that sort of thing. And to our delight, we found the skeleton of a Romano-British woman who was 6'2", which was absolutely astounding, because Romano-British women weren't normally 6'2", and I think she still lies in the British Museum because she was so extraordinary. Anyhow, through archaeology, I then developed another parallel interest. I went very rapidly to Incas and Aztecs and Mayas, and I used to teach myself Maya and hieroglyphics and the number systems at school. And so that was, and it was at school also that I worked out why I didn't like archaeology and liked anthropology, which was basically in the context of South America, where the two run very much more in parallel than most archaeology and anthropology does. It just seemed to me that although you needed to know about archaeology in order to appreciate the full glory of Americanist anthropology, on the other hand, why on earth would one want to go and do archaeology if you could actually see the real people in the flesh? So that also convinced me that I should become an anthropologist. So
you got into King's.
I got into King's
To read Arcanant?
To read Arcanant, but before I went to King's, I put into action the plan that I'd already hatched to go to South America. So I worked on the Victoria line, which was being built. I worked with a whole lot of Irish navvies, and they earned a hell of a lot. We did day and night, 1 week day, 1 week night, shifts of 12 hours, and it was fairly dangerous. There was a hierarchy. We had tunnellers at the front and people who loaded things at the back, and I was a loader. And the Irish navvies drank. They used to earn an absolute fortune, and every Friday they would drink it all up, and on Monday they'd come back to earn the next whack. I tried to avoid drinking and stashed it away to pay for my trip to South America, or contribute towards my trip to South America. And my parents chipped in, because by now they thought this went with parental approval. And I went to Venezuela because I went by boat, and had hoped to stay in Venezuela just because it was the first place the boat got to. And when I got there, I found that it was extraordinarily expensive. I mean, in those days, Venezuela, as is now, was an oil economy, and they were still using sort of big silver coins and things, and it was just prohibitively expensive. So I spent about a week in Caracas and decided that I had better move on. And on the ship, I'd met an English school teacher and his wife who were going out to teach in Colombia. And they'd said that if I went to Colombia, I could go and stay with them. So I got on a bus and went to Bogota and went to stay with these people called Warren, Forrest Warren, and somebody Warren. And arrived in Bogota, and started looking for Indians and very quickly heard about this character Reichel Dolmatov, Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov, who was the sort of doyen of Colombian archaeology and anthropology, and went to see him and said, I want to go and visit Indians. And he said, well, the place to go is the Vaupés, which is where I later did my research, which is on it sort of straddles the equator, or it's on the equator on both sides of the Colombia-Brazil border. So I spent about 9 months in Colombia. I learned quite a lot of Spanish, and I went initially to the Vaupés, and I spent, I think it must have been a good month or so with some people called the Cubeo, which was Irving Goldman wrote his first monograph called the Cubeo, and I spent time with the Cubeo, and I still have upstairs my first ever field notes, field diaries with little drawings of material culture and sort of odd observations about sort of behaviour and things. I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was very happy to see Indians and live with them and be in the forest and see all this, it was a bit like going back to Jamaica as far as I was concerned, and delighted to see all that stuff again. And I then, while I was in the Vaupés with the Cubeo, I heard of this other river called the Pirá-Paraná, where Christian and I went and did our field research. And people said that people didn't go to the Pirá-Paraná because in the 1930s,
How do you spell?
Pirana, Fish River it means. In the 1930s, some of the people who lived there had killed some rubber gatherers, and this had had a very dramatic effect. That act, plus the fact that the river is extremely difficult to travel on because it's got a lot of dangerous rapids, meant that the people there had remained relatively not uncontacted, but they'd been left alone. The missionaries hadn't gone there and messed them about, and there'd only been sporadic contact with rubber gatherers and things. Anyhow, people said it was terribly dangerous. You were sure to get killed if you went there, and I thought, well, they won't kill me. I'm some nice guy, so that's where I'm going to do my field research. So having done that, I then travelled around various other bits. I went all over Colombia. I went down into the Putumayo in the south and visited a group called the Cofán. I got to know Colombia pretty well. And came back to Cambridge knowing not only that I wanted to study anthropology, but actually knowing where I intended to do my field research, because if they could be isolated, I mean this isn't fashionable to say these things now, but in those days and with my mindset at the time, this was certainly what I wanted to do. So I came back to study anthropology in Cambridge, and wherever possible I used South American material as there wasn't much available, but I tried to use as much as possible in my studies. And I did things like I chose to do the Southeast Asia special area, or the South Asia special area, partly because Leach and Tambaya taught it, and Leach was my hero, at least my guru at the time, but also because I by my second or third, it must have been in my third year, I realized that things like, I knew that by then that in Amazonia you had systems of Dravidian kinship and bilateral cross-cousin marriage, so that I was already preparing the way by dealing with an area which had analogous kinship systems and things like that, although in a cultural context which was radically different. And
who were your main teachers and what were their characteristics at that time? You mentioned Tambaya and Leach. Did Tambi teach you personally, or just lecture?
Leach was my main teacher. Leach was the person who supervised. Leach I sort of felt already a kinship with, and also a debt of gratitude to, because as far as I was concerned, he'd sort of saved my life. And I also liked him. I found him absolutely terrifying to begin with. As a first-year undergraduate, he was very moody and very unpredictable. And he was very difficult because I learnt very quickly that he was a dangerous character, because if as a sort of willing first-year undergraduate you wrote an essay which agreed with him, he used to test you by, he didn't like you agreeing with him because he felt that he was trying to teach you to be critical. So that if you agreed with him, he would get quite sort of testing and say, well, why do you agree? What about this? And you'd have to justify your agreement. But if, on the other hand, you disagreed with him, as you know, he was quite vain. He was slightly sort of attitude, how dare you contradict me? So that you were damned if you do and damned if you don't. At least that's how it seemed to me. And he was also quite irascible. I remember even when Christine and I were writing up, we used to go and see his secretary, June, and get what we call a weather forecast. And so we'd book an appointment with Edmund, and we'd go and say to June, what's the weather like today? And if she'd say bad, we'd say, well, cancel the appointment. So, but he was an absolutely wonderful supervisor, and he taught me how to supervise in the way that, for instance, one would get one's essays used to come back with little numbers by the side, with little essays themselves, point number 1, and then you'd have a whole sort of Leech response to your essay. You felt, wow, this, I haven't been wasting my time. It was a really serious dialogue, and I always tried to emulate that with my own students, and that's why sort of supervision took the act of supervising was far more time consuming than it probably should have been, but he was very good and very interesting, and he was right at the sort of cutting edge, so that I remember being made to very early on, we were made to read about there was Andrew and Marilyn Strathern were out in New Guinea at the time, and people were just discovering these extraordinary exchange systems, which later became, the sort of mocha and things which we now teach to undergraduates, were just in the air there. So Edmund would make us read all these very bad descriptions of the mocha and the tea. I remember writing an essay on the mocha and the tea and wondering why was I reading all this stuff? But it was clearly so
The word tea.
it was the tea was another version of the mocha.
Spelt tea.
I think it was the TI. I can't remember who does or did the tea. Anyhow, you just felt that you were all the time right at the cutting edge of his anthropology. He was, of course, extremely partisan, and as Alfred Gell wrote in the introduction to his book, The Art of Anthropology, that there was a sense in which it wasn't. I don't know that our teachers meant it to be like this, but it was the great days of the supposed battle between Leech and Fortes, which was largely, I think, conducted through the pages of JRAI, where it got quite heated, and Jack Goody got his fair bit of flack, like that famous Rethinking Anthropology, where Edmund refers to mistakes in his field notes and that sort of thing. But it was certainly the case that I, and I think Alfred also, we felt, you were either on that side, the Edmund Tamby side, or you were on the Maya Jack side, and we were certainly on the Edmund Tamby side, or the Edmund side. So I don't.
He says that Jack was regarded as the devil, and you didn't go to his lectures.
Yes, no, we didn't go to his lectures. We went to Ray O'Fortune's lectures because they were so hilariously funny and just completely off the wall. He would stand with his back to the audience for an hour writing mathematical symbols on the board, and we would just hardly anybody went except us. We just went for entertainment's sake. But we didn't go to Jack's lectures. No, Jack, lovable though he wasn't a particularly fluent lecturer in those days. That was another thing. But so most of the stuff we did, I did, was very much with Edmund, and then I think it was, I can't remember whether it was in my second year or third year that Edmund became provost. Must have been can't remember, can you remember, 65, 66? I think perhaps it was in my third year. Anyhow, then Tamby took over from Edmund in King's and became Director of Studies, so that I also worked quite a lot with Tamby, who was also, I mean, you know him well, very, very interesting, very inspiring, and also somebody who at the time was much more approachable he was much more sort of, you could be a mate of Tamby, whilst I don't think Edmund was quite he was a friend, but he was slightly distant.
Were these the days when there was such a small student body that you went off with the lecturers to the...
Oh yes. There were about, I think there were about 8 or 9 people in my year, and that's something which has changed a lot, because I think today, we have classes of 30, 40 in a year, and of those, possibly only 2 or 3 per year, I don't know my exact figures, but roughly that sort of thing might be going on to do the subject, whilst when I was an undergraduate, we were taught on the assumption that we were all going to go on, and indeed most of us did, so that in my year there was, who was there? There was Rod Stirrett, Vanessa Mayer, Ibrahim Tahir, Roger Ballard. I'm sure I ought to remember. Caroline was 1 year ahead of me. And there were
And Alfie, or not?
Alfred, yes, of course, Alfred was in my year. Can't remember the others. Anyhow, but most of them went on to become anthropologists. So it was a different sort of atmosphere than I think it is today.
The other people who might have been there, I suppose Ray was then. Was he already lecturing then?
Ray was there. I don't remember much about Ray. Of course I remember a lot about him as a colleague later on, but I think he was very much within the goody 40s Africanist camp, and so part of what Alfred called on being on the side of the devil. And
G.I. Jones was there.
G.I. Jones, again an Africanist. The people that I remember, I remember James Woodburn very well indeed, because James was bubbling with enthusiasm. He was fresh back from the Hadza, and I still have my notes from James's lectures about everything about the Hadza that you ever wanted to know, and more. And he was a great enthusiast. It was great fun. But I think my intellectual life was very much dominated by Leach and Tambaya, and also Noor Yalman, who taught the Asian special area.
Now, how did you get on with Maya at that time?
Again, as an undergraduate, the only thing that there are 2 things that I can remember about Maya. One of which was his proverbial first year lectures on the necktie. That's all I can remember, was that he lectured to us about the necktie. I can't actually remember why, probably about rolls or something. And I can also remember him, yes, I can remember presenting my first seminar paper, in that he used to run a 3rd year seminar. And I remember us all feeling very frightened by the idea of presenting in a seminar, and actually Maya being extremely good at running the seminar. He was very good. His eyes used to go round the room, and they would light on you, and he'd say, "Well, Stephen, what do you think?" And you would have to say, and then you'd have to present. But he would pick out people and get them to participate, and that was very good. He was good. But I didn't have much to do with him, and in fact, he made a stab at kind of recruiting me when I'd finished as an undergraduate. I announced my intention that I wanted to stay on as a graduate student, and I wanted to work in Amazonia. And I remember Maya inviting me into his room. He had that room at the bottom of the stairs in the library, and he had a picture of Ghana on the wall, and it had I don't think they were flags, I think it had sort of grid shape or something. And he said, "Now, Stephen, you don't want to go to Amazonia. Look what happened to Francis Huxley." So Francis actually was held up. Nobody works in Amazonia. Anthropology doesn't happen in Amazonia. Why don't you go to Africa? We've got whoever it was, Pepe Roberts here and Keith Hart here. Now there's a place here that you could go to. And I said, no, Mara, I'm sorry, I want to go to, I really do want to go to South America, and I'm determined to go to South America. And there I shall go. And I actually having graduated, I tried to escape from Cambridge. I thought that, I'd done my stretch at Cambridge, and Peter Revere had recently come back from doing research amongst the trio, and I think by the time I graduated, I think Revere's book, or just soon afterwards, Revere's book on the trio, I'll have to look up the dates, but certainly Mabry Lewis was his book Aquis Avanti Society, and Revere's book Marriage Amongst the Trio were coming out or had come out, and Peter by then was the only established Americanist teaching in, or the only established Amazonianist in teaching in England, and I thought that I wanted to go to Oxford to work with Peter Revere. And in retrospect, I'm extremely glad it didn't happen, because it couldn't happen. What happened was that I went over to Oxford and I had an interview with Godfrey Leonhardt and Raymond Carr, the historian, who also read about fox hunting. And to my annoyance, they said to me, "Why do you want to do research in Amazonia? Why don't you do research in the highlands of, what's Amazonia? Amazonian Indians are completely irrelevant to today's world. Why don't you do research on peasants and indigenous peoples or peasants in the highlands?"
Scotland, you mean?
No, the highlands of the Andes, the highlands of Latin America. And I said, in fact, I'm sure I rather irritated him, but I said to Godfrey Leonhardt, "Why, on the basis of this, didn't you go and do your field work in Khartoum? What relevance did the Dinka have?" And bit of a smart-ass reply, but anyhow, that and various other things meant that they said I was much too much of a romantic, and that I couldn't come to Oxford. So I came back slightly with my tail between my legs and said to Edmund, "Well, can I stay here and work with you?" And in fact, I was extremely lucky, because I knew Peter and still know Peter very well, so that I got Peter was a friend who actually came over then during my first year as a graduate student. Peter used to come over and started giving lectures on South America as a special area, so that it was beginning to enter into the anthropologist consciousness by then. But so that I maintained contact with Peter, but on the other hand, working with Edmund was very, very exciting, not only because he was damn good as an anthropologist, but he was particularly useful for us who were working on Amazonia, because he would say, when we came back from the field, we would write things, and he'd say, "I don't give a damn whether this is what the Americanists or the Amazonianists say. It's absolute balls." He says balls. And sometimes he was right, and if he wasn't right, you would really have to, you'd have to persuade him that you were right, so that it made you really think, and he was much more challenging, whilst I think that if I'd been working with Peter, it would have been very interesting, but in a sense slightly too cozy. And I think, just sort of reeling forward to the present, I think one of the problems of anthropology in Amazonia has tended to be that it has been a slightly isolated, closed circle. And I certainly feel, insofar as I've tried to break out of that sort of slightly closed world, that was one of the influences, one of the important influences of Edmund on my life, was that he allowed me to break out. I suppose it's worth bringing in the we. When I say when we came back, because as I explained earlier, I had met Christine at school. Christine like me, rebelled against doing science and medicine, but more radically, so that she went to art school and then realized that she was missing out on anthropology, or missing out on academia, on academic studies, so that she walked into LSE, and I think she met Forge, and she said, I want to come study sociology here. And he said, well, you have to have an interview. And she said, no, you don't understand. I'm typical Christine. I'm a different case. I'm a mature student. I've been at art school. I left school some time ago, etc., etc. Anyhow, she got herself into LSE and started doing sociology with a sort of bias towards anthropology, and very quickly transferred to anthropology. And she was taught by Lucy Mayer and James Woodburn and Raymond Firth, and then by Anthony Forge. But she was a year behind me, although she's actually older than I am. She was a year behind me, so that when I graduated, by then I got married to her in my second year as an undergraduate here, and we knew we wanted to do field work together. There was some debate as to where we were going to go. She was quite keen on New Guinea under the Forgian influence, and I was absolutely certain that I was going to Amazonia. And as I knew actually where I was going, I think I kind of won the game. Anyhow, so I spent a year having graduated, knocking about here in King's, supervising and reading as much as I could about Amazonia, whilst Christine did her finals. And when she then graduated, and she graduated in July, and by the end of August she was in the field with me. So much for pre-field work training and all that rubbish that they have to do nowadays. Didn't do her the slightest harm.
Did you do any pre-field work training?
Well, I spent a year, and I spent a year of reading in a slightly I read virtually all the available historical materials that I could find on the Vaupers, which has been very useful. But I didn't do anything like methodology or how to do it. I mean, Edmund told me a little bit once about what kind of notebooks to use. That was about all.
What did he say?
He said, we used reporters' notebooks and indelible ink, and he said that we should use carbon copies, and we very rapidly gave that one up and just used single notebooks. The indelible ink was very useful. We overturned in a rapid, and I lost some of my notebooks, and they were recovered about 4 months later from the bottom of the river, and they were still legible, so that he was quite right about the indelible ink. But so anyhow, so Christine and I were two people who were already going to Amazonia. Then that's another point. In my year, there was Peter Silverwood Cope, and he was a friend of mine, and he wanted his father was a diplomat in Brazil. In fact, I think his father was a spy, actually.
Mm-hmm. Is this on the record?
I don't see why not. I mean, I think. I don't say. He wanted to go to South America and had been to South America, and so we teamed up. And then there was Bernard Arcand, a student who was doing the MPhil had come from Canada, and he wanted to work in the Nicobar Islands, but he couldn't get a permit because the Nicobar Islands were off limits. The Indian government wouldn't allow him to go there. So as he was friends of Pete Silverwood and Christine and myself, we kind of roped him in. And he worked with these people called the Quiver on the plains of. We'd by then decided all to go to Colombia, because what Peter Silverwood, Christine and I did was, Christine and I were working with the Tucano, or the Barasana, but other Tucanoan groups, and all the Tucanoans were in contact with these nomadic hunters, the Maku, in a sort of symbiotic relationship. And so Pete was going to do the Maku to our Tucano. And Bernard decided to join us. So Bernard got a pin and just went blunk like that on a map of the sort of flat, jungly bits of Colombia. and landed up with some people called the Quiver. It was Bernard who created or invented the aphorism about, we were talking at lunchtime about tribes getting anthropologists they deserve and anthropologists getting the tribes they deserve. Well, Bernard's version of that was, if you can't get a good culture, at least get a good beach. Because this was when people were beginning to do anthropology on Italians in Bedford, and us lot thought, why on earth would anybody want to go and study Italians in Bedford if you can go to Colombia or somewhere? But
film, didn't he? The Last of the Quiver.
That's right. Yes, yeah, that's Bernard. Yes, he was actually here at that dinner party that we had. So anyhow, Edmund solved our money problems by employing, Edmund then put in this massive project to the ESRC for research in the Colombian Amazon, so that Edmund invented his own big research project and employed all four of us as researchers, so that suddenly, this is the we to who I was referring to, suddenly, whereas before there had been really no study of lowland South America and Britain, suddenly in Cambridge there were these four people, all Edmund students, going out at once to do field research in Colombia.
So Christine was one of his students?
Christine was one of his students, and
did he get on well with her and she with him?
Yes, there was a sort of breaking in period, because when Christine and I came back from the field, we wrote our first bits of, our first tentative chapters for our thesis, and I remember writing my first tentative chapter, and as usual Edmund sent me back 10 pages of detailed commentary, and Christine sent in her first chapter, and she got back something like saying, "Fine, Edmund." She went to see him personally, said, "Look here, just because I'm a woman and just because I'm Stephen's wife, you bloody well treat me in the same way as you treat him." And Edmund's kind of terribly sorry.